You aren't being a proper woman, therefore you must be a witch. 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 You must be a witch.
So, welcome on this end of November full moon, this episode of Missing Witches, and this strange tipping end part of this fucking strange year. This is the water freezing moon and this beaver pelt moon, and it's the morning moon, as in, in morning. To me, it feels like we are and will be for a long time in mourning for the trauma and loss of this pandemic year, but there's also this little flower of hope. And so it feels so right to get to talk to our guest for this episode, Saleema Nawaz, author of the beautiful and deeply, weirdly prophetic novel, Songs for the End of the World. I love this book so much. But Saleema, hi and welcome to the Missing Witches cabin. I wondered if you would maybe introduce yourself, since I feel like you will know yourself better and what you want to share about yourself better than I can.
Sure. Thank you. And hi. Thanks for having me. So my name is Saleema Nawaz, as you said. I feel like you kind of covered everything, Risa, but I will read my little personal intro anyways. I'm a Montreal-based writer. I've written short stories and 2 novels, including Songs for the End of the World, which came out this year from McClellan and Stewart. It's gotten some attention because, it was written completely before COVID-19, but it happens to be about a handful of interconnected characters living through the opening weeks and months of a novel coronavirus pandemic that also within the book takes place in 2020.
God, I loved this book, and it just is so deeply surreal in a deeply surreal year. I can only imagine how surreal that's been for you.
It has been really surreal, but there's this weird way, and I haven't really said this before, but I feel like the Missing Witches podcast is an okay place to say this, which is that in some ways it was almost not surprising, even though it was so surreal. For anyone who's read the book, there's a character in the novel who's a writer who has written a pandemic novel that within my novel, it seems as though his pandemic novel is coming true, right. Which is like this extra meta level, but to go back to from the very first moments I was planning the novel, I was imagining what if it came true, Wow. I imagined this happening from the very first moment I started thinking about the book. That's why there is a character in the book who has written a pandemic novel that seems as though it's coming true. So of course it's incredibly surreal and it's super weird, but it also takes me back to that first moment of conceiving the book and imagining this exact thing happening.
God, I don't even know how to wrap my mind around what that is like. I mean, except that there is that moment of writing that I can relate to, where you're like, this is both story, just the fun and joy and crazy head fuck of telling a story, and also this is true somehow.
It took me so long to write it. I was writing it for years, and there were times where it just felt like I would never be finished writing it. And now it feels like I'm living in it, and it still isn't finished. So that is kind of the freaky part.
Yeah. And now you're a little bit outside of the bounds of the book, but you're still, True. It still must feel like you're inside the fictional world.
Yeah, a little bit.
So where did the story come from? Or in a bigger way, where do you think stories come from?
That's a big question. I think, I think stories are are inside us, that they're always within us. Human beings, have always been telling stories, and it's like part of our makeup, like it's part of our DNA, like those myths and those archetypes are just part of who we are. So I think stories are inevitable in a way.
I always have this image in my mind since I read this. I think it's an Elizabeth Gilbert thing, talking about she felt like she was always just watching like wind come across fields, that was the feeling of like waiting for stories and being hit by them.
Oh, wow. Yeah, it's a beautiful image. I know when I was younger, I had this sense of needing to wait for inspiration. Like, not when I was really young, like when I was a kid, I would just, write incessantly, about like orphan girls and stuff like that. But then when I was sort of like trying like more seriously to be a writer, then I just like felt like I had to wait for this, almost this like overwhelming urge to write, and like this kind of like special tingly feeling that would like drive me to write. But since then, it's like hard to like remember back to that feeling, even though I know there are aspiring writers and other writers out there who feel that way. But now it's just like there's almost too much to write about. It's like inspiration is the ocean, and it's there. You just dip your toe in, and there's just like an ocean of things, of stories.
Are you comfortable with the idea of magic? I didn't really ask you this when we talked about having you on this podcast, but like, is that something you think about? How does that, because it feels like what you're describing is so connected to the way some people on this podcast and in many other places have talked about spirit or magic, this becoming acquainted with it was like meeting a giant reserve or ocean of inspiration.
Yeah, I have so many thoughts about magic, but in terms of like the magic of writing, I guess specifically, I've found that writing, it's a process that has magical moments. Certainly, if you can achieve that sort of flow state, where the ego disappears, but a lot of it I would liken more to something like construction work. So for me, it's really like, it's more like reading is magic, right? That experience is instantaneous, and something is being conjured in other people's minds, through your own efforts as the writer and theirs as the reader too. And so the book is where minds are meeting across time and place. And that's the real magic. A book is a place of encounter. So if you're doing it right, you can be making magic by writing a book. But the process of writing it, in my experience, is sometimes more akin to the other kind of magic. Like it's a trick in some ways, because with fiction anyways, you're trying to make people believe things that aren't, strictly true. But of course, there also has to be real truth within it. So it's like both a kind of sleight of hand as well as a kind of bringing forth of deep inner truths, that will resonate with people.
And that part of it might be more like craft, which has a really powerful overlap, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
Have you had witchy moments, quote unquote, before this moment of realizing you'd written a book about what was happening?
Yeah, I have had many witchy moments over the years, moments of like, spidey senses tingling, premonitions of danger, or, other just weird occurrences. And I have definitely described myself as low-key psychic to many people before. But it's, it's the kind of thing that I feel like in general, I've like moved further away from over the years, because I think anyone who has ever like come out as a witch to their friends, as I did in high school, or, come out as anything that's a kind of fringe belief or practice or outside of the norms of of society. It's just like once you've kind of faced that blowback or that judgment, you know, you're just always hesitant, you know, and yeah, so you kind of observe these moments and you kind of felt them away and
I'm really comfortable being a witch in safe witch circles, you know. I was like, and just being my own version of whatever that's going to be. And I think a lot about the idea of like you talked about the construction worker side of creativity, you know, that I love the way you describe that like there's an element, I think, of magic or craft or whatever in that part of it too. We were talking to a witch for another episode who made a really astute observation. I think we talk sometimes about how like you have to do the mundane work and then you can do, you know, a ritual or something, and that those two pieces go together, but you have to do the mundane. And her flip on it, Loretta, the Death Witch, was that nothing is mundane, you know, that all of that work, in her case, she's talking about activism in the streets, that all of that is part of the magic of making a new world, you know. And I think writing a novel that's really full of like love and hope during a global pandemic can help us kind of craft that into the world, you know.
Yeah.
Love that there's that hope in it.
Yeah, I think a lot of the everyday things that we do, you know, those everyday rituals, those everyday practices that underpin everything are important, and you definitely can't finish a novel without a lot of grunt work, unfortunately. I wish it were just like magic, like literal magic. But sadly not.
No, sadly not. Yes, we're in the process of edits still, and definitely not magic. Lots of just rereading, catching typos.
Yep.
I think that there's a lot of people who have a book inside of them that they don't know how to get out.
Yeah.
Do you have advice on, you know, maybe not necessarily writing something prophetic, but at least maybe true?
Oh, that's a good question. I think something that is probably relevant to like the writing of my writing of this novel and other things I've written is to tap into something that you're afraid of. I think that writing about our fears can be really, you know, not just, you know, therapeutic, but like it can be powerful in that there's an emotional charge there, you know. I think you can end up tapping into something really powerful and something true, and it just makes the stakes higher, I think, for you as the writer if you're trying to write about something that scares you. And I think that whatever it is that you're afraid of, there's probably a good reason that you're afraid of that thing, you know. So, you know, if you were to write something about climate change, you know, because you're afraid of it, you know, the quite a reasonable fear, and you know, sadly there would be, you know, quite a good chance of that coming true. But I think when you have that kind of like emotional honesty, which you kind of have when you're sort of facing your fear by writing about it, or, you know, even transform. I don't mean necessarily like writing about like I am scared of this because, but just using that energy to fuel your writing can get you to interesting places.
I think that that's probably super powerful, both like creatively and therapeutically.
Yeah, I think it could be.
Yeah. And I mean, I think that's part of when we talk about like using tarot, or, you know, using these kinds of like divination tools as therapy, that can be more like a way of having a conversation with maybe what you're afraid of, if you frame it that way. Are there rituals or practices that you use to kind of, I don't know, get acquainted with fear?
With fear specifically, I would
Or with something
say,
you're afraid of? Because I feel like I am so numb from the last years, I've talked about this before, but like I've just been like so afraid. And
yeah.
and I know that sort of a characteristic of trauma is that you don't start, you will sort of be in this frozen state. You won't start to feel the trauma until you're safe. And I think that that's kind of coming for a lot of us, that there's a little bit of change of safety in the change in presidents.
Yeah. It's interesting. Like, I sort of feel like part of the way that I've been coping with the pandemic has been to kind of somewhat like somewhat like enable robot mode a little bit. Like, all the feelings are tamped down. It's just like, okay, well, I'm just gonna do my thing. I'm just gonna do this, this, and this. And that it's like there's no space for those emotions to happen, because you can sense they're not going to be like productive. They're not going to help you. And I would say that I would have probably, to a certain extent, that has been like a running theme, in my life. And certainly I was definitely raised in an environment with a lot of fear, and I'm a pretty fearful person in general, I guess. Like, I'm just a timid, physically timid, person, and risk averse person, I guess would probably be the way to put that. Like, I'm nervous in a car. Like, I don't drive, so it's like, even if I'm a passenger in a car, I'm like, I'm like gripping the handle, like that you hang dry cleaning on or whatever. So yeah, in terms of like,
so your rituals are maybe less about like getting in touch with fear and more about a healthy creative relationship with fear.
Yeah, I mean, I think a creative relationship with fear is probably like the most productive thing I can do with it personally. And I, like, in some ways it feels like repressing the fears that I have is like the only way to deal with them, like the only way to be a functioning person. But I think other people could probably, like, I actually like what you said about the tarot in terms of that as being a conversation. Like, I think that's a useful tool for conversation with yourself, like with things you're trying to work out. Or, I think it's even interesting from a story point of view, potentially, if you're working with characters, it can be interesting in that way. Certainly, like, a ritual that I use to self-soothe, which is, I think, a very common, secular ritual, but one which is actually pretty witchy, is like the hot bath with, candles, salts, oils. Like, it's all there. It's like a big potion that you are like immersing yourself into, and which is very soothing.
Something that we all need and deserve, like,
Yeah.
I think a useful concept around this full moon can just, well, it's a morning moon. So if there's something that you're mourning, then giving yourself permission to do that is a good idea. And then it can also be good magic at this time to get rid of something, even if you're just going to clean a drawer. That's a good practice for right now. So and that's something I'm going to just continue to try to carry for my COVID terror coping mechanism. Is just lovingly dust one thing.
That's a good idea.
That's what I got today. Oh man, thank you so much for being here with us. It feels like soothing, even though we're talking about fear and anxiety. I'm a very anxious person too. And all of this work has been helpful for me, and just in writing, especially, and just being able to talk about it. And I loved reading your book so so much. I hope more of our readers can discover more of your work beyond this novel, through our conversation and finding and following you. Can you let people know how they can find you and follow you and pay you to do things, pay you to write, buy your book? I don't know what.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I guess I'm online at saleemanawaz.com. I finally cracked and got a website. And I'm on Twitter. And, I would really recommend, if you are going to seek out Songs for the End of the World, to do it at your local independent bookstore.
Yeah, we love our local. We just got a great big box from Drawn and Quarterly for my kid's second birthday. And that, again, drenched me in the magic of books. Just getting to pour over them with a 2-year-old.
Oh, yeah. Yay. And Drawn and Quarterly is my preferred bookstore.
That's our home base in Montreal.
Yeah.
Thanks again. And thanks for your beautiful book and spending this time with us.
Thanks for having me.
Don't forget to go to foxglovefarm.com and use offer code MissingWitches.